One of the most oppressive classes in PvP right now that most people are complaining about is the Shadow Priest, and specifically because of Shadow Word Death, basically being able to one-shot people. This is an issue because there is no counterplay to that, and Blizzard now has taken a stance to intervene. Basically, Shadow Priests are getting the balanced Druid treatment, not necessarily nerfed, but also not necessarily buffed. Ideally, it is a rework, which, as we all know, kind of always works out to be just kind of a nerf. So there was some class tuning that happened yesterday. I did not cover that on the channel because unfortunately, right as I got off stream, I got some news about a tragedy in my family, and I couldn't bring myself to work on a video. So I'm sorry for that, but I will update you guys on everything right now. First of all is Shadow Priest receiving the newest nerf hammer today. And specifically that nerf is going to Shadow Word Death. For the Shadow Word Death, base damage modifier was reduced by 40%, and its spell power coefficient was reduced from about 64% to about 43%. This should be a 33 to 40% damage nerf from Shadow Word Death for all Shadow Priests. Now, you probably won't be nuked by this ability anymore in PvP, but how much does this hurt Shadow Priests in PvE? And we'll look at that in a second, but the developer notes were basically saying that Shadow Word Death was doing a higher percentage of a player's actual damage than they were anticipating. And they could see this getting out of hand in PvE as players got more spell power. Basically, getting gear from the raid is going to make you significantly stronger, meaning you do more damage, but you also kind of nuke yourself for more damage. But the big issue was that there was no counterplay to this ability in PvP. There's nothing really you can do outside of using a greater shadow protection potion, and this was probably the last ability right now that there was no way of getting around it, just kind of nuking you in PvP. Now you're probably thinking to yourself, that's not true. A lot of things are oppressive, and I will get to that in a second. But first, Shadow Priests also did receive a little bit of a buff to some of their other abilities, mostly for PvE. Mind Spike had its damage increased by 10%, and Void Plague had its damage increased by 10%. Now, if you look at the legend Incan, the Blood DPS god in Wrath of the Lich King, and currently ranked #1 Shadow Priest in Season of Discovery, if you look at his damage breakdowns, you'll notice that Mind Spike is almost exactly as much damage as Mind Blast on a damage breakdown. So buffing this by 10% is a decent buff, as well as Void Plague actually getting a 10% buff is very, very minimal, but is it enough to overcompensate for losing 30 to 40% damage on an ability that's literally doing 1/5 of your damage? It does mean that this will be a nerf to Shadow Priests in PvE, and this does feel bad because Shadow Priests were finally feeling very strong in PvE. The only things they were losing to were Warlocks that are at the top, Mages also at the top, and behind them is Melee Hunters. So Warlocks and Mages and Melee Hunters, which is a little bit of a gap between them all, and that gap will grow quite a bit. But then we had Shadow Priests actually doing pretty well, already up here in the top 50, feeling very, very solid. Unfortunately, we will see that drop now, and Shadow Priests will lose a little bit of viability, but they still are one of the most useful classes in the entire raid, specifically because of Vampiric Embrace. This ability is so strong that 20% of the shadow damage they're doing is being healed to the actual entire group. This is enough healing to potentially later on allow us to bring only one healer to the raid, because the Shadow Priests can actually out heal almost all of the mechanics in the Gnomergan raid. There's a lot of AoE damage that goes out, and the Shadow Priests can just mitigate all of that while outputting a very solid amount of damage. If you want to see a very solid Shadow Priest, one of the best in the world, and great guides, check out my boy Pants Gaming over on YouTube. Now, the other class tuning that happened are that mages can finally actually make water at level 40. The highest level of water at level 40 was only giving them 2 water per every single time they cast the ability. Now it will go up to 20 coming in the next week. It's already in the game. It's already at 10. So right now you're making 10. I don't know why they did it that way, but it was announced that this will go up to 20 just in one single cast. This is a great quality of life thing. Paladins also having their mana issues dealt with, as the mana costs of Exorcism and Holy Shock have been reduced by 80%, and Beacon of Light's base mana cost was also greatly reduced. Shamans saw a buff to their DPS output mostly, so shamans for dual wield and for two-handers did see a buff, although I think this is more of a buff for dual wield. The dual wield specialization rune now provides 50% extra damage to your offhand whenever you have that equipped. Also, Lava Lash now gets a 50% increased damage if Flame Tongue weapon is imbued on your offhand. I know that's not like the favorite thing for shamans, but it is a buff. Now, the chance to proc Maelstrom weapon was increased by every shaman in the game. It's a 50% higher chance when your main hand weapon or your two-handed weapon is imbued with Wind Fury. So this was an increase to all shamans to get Maelstrom to proc so that they can have some instant casts of their abilities. This is actually pretty nice and a good change. Enhanced shamans are one of the worst performing classes in the game, so they absolutely do need some love. If we look at it, it is marksmanship hunters, balanced druids, enhanced shamans, feral druids, and paladins that are just all the way at the bottom right now, like DPS paladins. These are the classes that definitely need the most love right now, while everyone else at the top is feeling decently strong. And I want to note, we've gotten no word back from Blizzard about bosses having 4,500 plus armor. It is a confirmation they are having that much armor, and it's meant to be that way, but I know that a lot of the community is asking for that to be reduced. The reason it is that way is because mechanical mobs in Classic World of Warcraft have always had double the armor values of everything else. Like, it's a double 2x modifier if you're a robot. So just know it is something they are aware of because it was a conscious thing. That's the way that this works in Classic, but essentially it's maybe not the best class design, but it also brings up the question, is it terrible to have casters be at the top in one phase? I'm genuinely curious. There's never been a phase where casters have been the strongest, and right now warlocks and mages are the two strongest classes by a decent margin, followed by melee hunter. So is there gonna be an issue with that? I don't know. Will we see a change? Definitely, maybe, or this could be the phase of the caster. That being said, one of the weakest classes, especially one of the weakest tanks in the game right now, has felt like Feral Druid. Feral Druids massively struggle with not only single target threat, but AoE threat as well. Their main AoE threat building ability is called Swipe, and basically it does not scale with anything. It just hits for the base damage. There's no way to make it stronger until Tuesday, because Blizzard is finally making it so that Swipe scales with attack power. Swipe will scale with 10% of your attack power, and the threat caused by the ability Swipe will now also be greatly increased. This is a huge AoE buff for Feral Druids, which had the weakest AoE in the game for threat. They also made it so that Lacerate is affected by the Berserk rune, meaning whenever you have Berserk up, your Lacerate ability will hit 3 targets instead of just Mangle, which is actually not the ability that Druid tanks use. They use Lacerate instead. Now, Feral Druid DPS did see a tiny buff with their Rip ability being increased from a 12-second base to a 16-second. This is a little bit longer of the duration, adding your damage to bleeds. Bleeds are also nerfed in the raid, and Rip is already something like around 4% of your overall damage in the raid. So this is like not very strong, but it's something for potentially one of the absolute weakest DPS classes currently in the raid right now. And I do think they will need a little bit more to be more viable, but also the Starfire change that we saw earlier in the week that nerfed Star Surge's damage, but made it so that your next Starfire actually hit for 66% more damage. There was actually a bug on Blizzard's end, so this was actually only applying about 52% damage onto your next Starfire. That has been adjusted or will be adjusted and fixed, but it also has been buffed. So now that will be 80% more damage onto your next Starfire. Predictions are showing that Starfire from this should hit without a crit for like 1920 at level 60. It's gonna be viable. It's gonna be viable. Will it be enough at level 40? We'll definitely have to see. All of our damage output is so ridiculous right now, and every class can basically one-shot anyone if there is no counterplay. And I want to bring that up as to one of the reasons why Shadow Priest probably saw this nerf. Basically, there was no way to get around it. It is a ranged ability and instant cast ability that can just what are you gonna do other than use a potion to resist some of the damage? So receiving a nerf on this ability does kind of make sense. If you are playing another class, if you're looking at a shaman, an LE shaman can just nuke you down 100 to 0 every 2 minutes. A mage with arcane surge can 100 to 0 you as well if they can pull it off, but there needs to be a setup. Warlocks have to get a good cast of Chaos Bolt, and that is a long enough cast for you to interrupt it if they want to hit you for 3,000 damage, and it also needs to crit. Melee hunters have no mobility, so if you just dead zone them, then they'll never be able to delete you. All of the other classes have a version of counterplay for you to deal with, but Shadow Word Death was just whenever their ability was back up on a pretty short cooldown, they could just hit you with it. It was the same issue with Star Surge, and I think that is the design philosophy of going and nerfing it specifically. And I want to leave you guys with this post from Agrand. A lot of tanks have been complaining about their AoE threat, while other tanks have better AoE threat. But the thing is, we still need to realize that we're playing classic World of Warcraft. Tanks are not supposed to have uncapped AoE threat. You're not supposed to be able to pull every mob in the entire instance and then nuke it down. That's not necessarily classic WoW. And this is something that they are aware of and might even need to tune down on some classes because some of them might be too strong, allowing you absolutely to pull it all and then nuke it. If mages start AoEing right away, you're probably gonna over aggro and then you need to kite. If you over aggroed at level 60 in a speed run, you literally lost your world buffs. It was GG, go again. If you literally, that's why you sundered on first global. Like if you attacked the wrong mob and not the tank's mob, you were done. You were done and it was over. So just remember guys, at its core, we're still playing classic World of Warcraft. Season of Discovery is amazing. It's new. Some things might be very strong, some things might be very weak, and the devs are working on that on a weekly basis. So expect class tuning, buffs, or some changes to happen pretty much on a weekly basis, at least until we're kind of decently far into the phase. So if you're sitting at the top right now, warlocks, mages, melee hunters, expect potentially to be looked at. If you're sitting at the bottom right now, DPS paladins, feral druids, enhanced shamans, expect hopefully a little bit of love. I'm of course curious what's all gonna happen, and I will keep you always updated here on the channel. So thank you all for all of the support that you guys have all shown me throughout the last few years of playing and covering World of Warcraft. I'll see you guys all on the next one and have an amazing weekend. I plan on spending my weekend with my family, so I just want to say I really genuinely appreciate all of the support you guys have shown me throughout these last few years, and I love you all, and goodbye.